He did not invite her to the gala to honor the past. He invited her to prove she no longer belonged in the future he had built from her sacrifices. The ballroom on the 41st floor of the Whitmore Grand Hotel shimmered above Manhattan like a room made of glass and judgment. Below, yellow cabs moved along Fifth Avenue in thin golden lines. Inside, 300 guests in black gowns and tailored tuxedos lifted champagne flutes beneath chandeliers bright enough to make every diamond look awake. Keller and Rowe Capital was celebrating its 25th anniversary, and Grant Keller stood at the center of it all, one hand resting lightly at the waist of Clara Whitmore, his new fiancée, the daughter of one of the city's oldest banking families. On the screen behind him, the company logo glowed in silver and blue, polished, expensive, untouchable. Evelyn Parker sat near the service doors, at a table so far from the stage that the music reached her a second late. That was not an accident. Grant had arranged every inch of the room. He had placed senators near the front, investors beneath the best lighting, Clara's parents beside the chairman, and Evelyn in the shadowed corner where waiters refilled water glasses and disappeared. Still she came, not in anger, not in a dress made to compete with Clara's emerald satin. Evelyn wore ivory, simple and quiet, with her blonde hair pinned low and a thin silver watch at her wrist. No necklace, no loud jewels, nothing that begged to be noticed. She looked like a woman who had stopped asking rooms for permission. When the master of ceremonies glanced down at his card and accidentally said, "And we're honored to welcome Mrs. Keller tonight," the room softened with the awkward silence of people suddenly smelling scandal. Grant laughed first, a small, practiced laugh. Then he stepped toward the microphone, smiling as if he were saving everyone from discomfort. "Please," he said, his voice warm enough to sound polite and cold enough to cut. "Don't call her that. Evelyn was Mrs. Keller once, but she never really belonged in this world." A few guests looked down. A few smiled because power had given them permission. Clara lowered her lashes and touched Grant's sleeve, not to stop him, but to decorate the moment. The laughter spread lightly, like ice cracking under polished shoes. Evelyn did not reach for her glass. She did not defend herself. She did not remind them that before Grant had corner offices, private drivers, and a last name people whispered near elevators, he had owned one navy suit with a frayed cuff, and she had been the one pressing it at midnight. She only looked at him, not with pain, not anymore. Her eyes moved past his smile, past Clara's hand on his arm, past the guests waiting to see whether she would shrink. She looked at the glowing Keller and Rowe logo behind him, the one Grant wore like a crown. Then, with a calm so complete it made the nearest waiter pause, Evelyn placed her untouched champagne glass on the white tablecloth. The crystal made the softest sound. Grant continued speaking, pleased with himself, telling the room about legacy, loyalty, and the kind of people who understood the language of power. But Evelyn heard something else beneath the applause. She heard the quiet vibration of her phone inside her clutch. One message. 3 words from Julian Mercer. Documents are signed. The message glowed for only a second before Evelyn let the phone slip back into her clutch, but it was enough to pull the past through the ballroom like a quiet draft under a locked door. Years before Keller and Rowe Capital had marble floors, private elevators, and a waiting list for summer interns from Ivy League schools, Grant Keller had stood in a cramped one-bedroom apartment in Queens with a nervous smile and a navy suit that did not fit right at the shoulders. Evelyn remembered that morning with cruel clarity. The radiator had hissed beside the window. Rain had tapped softly against the fire escape. Grant had been 28, ambitious, brilliant, and terrified that ambition would not be enough. He kept checking his watch, then his resume, then the mirror above the dresser, as if one wrong breath could ruin the interview that he believed would change his life. Evelyn had already worked a breakfast shift at the diner 6 blocks away. Her feet ached inside cheap black shoes, and her hair still carried the faint smell of coffee and maple syrup, but she stood behind him with a needle between her fingers, carefully fixing the loose seam near his cuff. He apologized for needing so much. She smiled and told him that one day he would buy 20 suits, and none of them would matter as much as this one. He laughed then, the kind of laugh that belonged to a man who still knew how to be grateful. That week, Evelyn had eaten instant noodles 3 nights in a row, so he could take a cab to Midtown without arriving soaked from the rain. She had printed his cover letters at the copy shop. She had sat on the kitchen floor beside him, sorting index cards while he practiced answers about market risk, client trust, and long-term strategy. When the call came 2 days later, Grant lifted her off the ground in their tiny kitchen and said, "You are my good luck." Back then, he called her home. Not background. Not burden. Home. At the gala, under lights worth more than that entire apartment building, Evelyn watched him speak about legacy as if he had been born with a skyline in his pocket. He told the room that Keller and Rowe was built by people who understood excellence, discipline, and refinement. Clara looked up at him with the polished admiration of someone who had never seen him rehearse confidence in a cracked bathroom mirror. Evelyn lowered her eyes to the white tablecloth and remembered the first time his language changed. It had not happened all at once. It came slowly, in small corrections. He stopped saying their apartment was cozy and started calling it temporary. He stopped thanking her for extra shifts and started asking why she still smelled like a diner when his colleagues came over. He stopped introducing her as the woman who believed in him and began saying, with a charming little laugh, that Evelyn kept him grounded. The words sounded kind to everyone else. To her, they felt like a door closing inch by inch. The first year after his promotion, he bought a black sedan, then a watch that cost more than her annual rent had once been, then a condo with windows facing the Hudson River. Evelyn had thought they were moving upward together. Grant had thought he was outgrowing proof of where he began. One evening, after a partner's dinner on the Upper East Side, he stood beside their closet and looked at her simple blue dress with a sigh so soft it almost passed for concern. "You need to learn how these rooms work," he said. She had nodded, because love sometimes teaches a woman to mistake being diminished for being improved. Now, across the ballroom, the same man lifted his glass and smiled at people who knew only the finished version of him. Evelyn did not interrupt. She did not correct the story. She simply sat still while Grant erased the woman who had helped him write the first page. The applause in the ballroom folded over Evelyn like a heavy curtain, and for one small breath, the chandeliers above Manhattan became the low amber lights of another room, another night, another ending. Grant had dressed up as elegance. It had happened at a restaurant on Madison Avenue, the kind of place where the menus had no prices and the waiters moved like secrets. Grant had chosen a corner table beside a wall of pale stone, far enough from the center that no one important would hear, close enough to the window that the city could witness what he was too polished to call abandonment. Evelyn remembered the white roses in the vase between them. Not red, not romantic. White, neat, almost corporate. A final arrangement. She had worn the blue dress he once told her was too simple, because part of her still believed simplicity might remind him of who they had been before the money learned his name. He arrived 12 minutes late, smelling faintly of expensive cologne and winter air, his coat folded over one arm, his phone already face down on the table, as if he had decided even his distractions deserved privacy. He did not order wine. That was how she knew. Grant Keller believed every difficult conversation should look tasteful from a distance. He thanked the waiter, adjusted his cuff links, and slid a cream-colored folder across the table. Evelyn looked at it for a long moment before she touched it. Divorce papers did not look dramatic. They looked clean. That was the cruelty of them. So much life could be flattened into paper, stapled at the corner, waiting for a signature. Grant spoke softly, almost kindly, and that made it worse. He said they had grown in different directions. He said the demands of his position had changed. He said public life required a partner who understood how to move through certain rooms. Evelyn listened without blinking, her hands folded in her lap beneath the table, her wedding ring catching a thin line of light. Then Grant leaned back, studied her face as if he were reviewing a proposal that had failed to meet expectations, and delivered the sentence he had been rehearsing. "I need a wife who can stand beside me without making the room feel smaller." The restaurant did not stop. Forks touched porcelain. Ice shifted in glasses. A woman nearby laughed at something harmless. The city kept moving outside the window, bright and indifferent. Evelyn felt the words enter quietly, not like a crash, but like a key turning in a lock she had been afraid to open. She did not ask whether there was someone else. She did not ask when he had stopped loving her. Those questions belonged to a version of her that still believed answers could return what disrespect had already taken. Instead, she picked up the pen, signed where his attorney had marked the page, and placed it beside the folder. Grant exhaled, relieved by her composure, mistaking silence for defeat. A few minutes later, Evelyn excused herself and walked to the restroom down a narrow hallway lined with framed photographs of old New York. Inside, the marble sink was cold beneath her fingers. She removed her wedding ring slowly, not because she wanted to hold on, but because 10 years deserved the dignity of not being thrown away in anger. She set it on the counter beside the folded hand towel. Then she washed her hands under warm water for a long time, watching the reflection of a woman who looked calm because she had no safe place left to fall apart. When she returned to the table, Grant was checking his phone. He did not notice that her ring was gone until she was already standing. Back in the ballroom years later, he was still speaking as if he had risen alone. Evelyn looked at his hand around the microphone and remembered the empty circle on her finger that night. She had walked out of that restaurant with no umbrella, no apology, and no idea that the life he rejected would become the one powerful enough to return and change the locks. The night after the divorce, Evelyn did not move into a brighter life. She moved into a smaller one. Her new apartment sat on the 9th floor of an old brick building near the Hudson River, where the elevator trembled between floors and the windows rattled whenever winter wind came off the water. The living room was barely wide enough for a second-hand sofa, a narrow desk, and 3 cardboard boxes she did not open for 2 weeks. There were no chandeliers, no marble counters, no skyline view designed to impress guests who never learned her name. There was only a kettle, a laptop, a lamp with a crooked shade, and the strange quiet of not having to wait for Grant to approve the shape of her breathing. At first, freedom felt less like triumph and more like standing barefoot on a cold floor. She woke before sunrise because her body still remembered all the years of preparing his mornings before her own. But now, the coffee was only for her. The toast could burn without becoming a disappointment to anyone. Her simple gray coat could hang by the door without Grant sighing at it. Little by little, the silence stopped sounding empty. It started sounding clean. Evelyn took a junior consulting position at a financial restructuring firm in Lower Manhattan, the kind of place Grant would have dismissed as too small to matter. The office was on the 22nd floor of a building with scratched elevator doors and fluorescent lights that hummed after 6 in the evening. No one there cared about her dress, her last name, or whether she could charm a table of private equity partners. They cared whether she could read a balance sheet until the lies inside it became visible. And Evelyn could. She learned slowly at first, then hungrily. Debt schedules, creditor agreements, distressed assets, shareholder rights, merger clauses, voting control, board consent, acquisition financing. Words that once sounded like Grant's language became tools in her hands. She wrote definitions on index cards and taped them above her desk. She listened to earnings calls during lunch. She borrowed thick books from the business library and carried them home in canvas bags that left red marks on her shoulders. At night, while the city glittered beyond the window like a party she had not been invited to, Evelyn sat under the crooked lamp and studied until the coffee in her mug went cold. Sometimes her eyes burned. Sometimes she fell asleep with a pen still between her fingers. But each morning, she woke with one more piece of herself returned. She did not become powerful in a montage. There was no sudden makeover, no miraculous inheritance, no room full of people applauding her transformation. There was only a woman in a quiet apartment, choosing discipline when no one was watching. The first time she identified a hidden liability in a client's report, her supervisor paused beside her desk and asked how she had seen it. Evelyn looked at the spreadsheet, then at the gray dawn rising behind the office glass, and said, "I know what people hide when they want to look stronger than they are." Years later, in the ballroom where Grant was still speaking beneath the Keller and Rowe logo, Evelyn felt the weight of all those mornings settle calmly in her chest. He thought he had left her outside his world. He had only given her the time to learn how its doors were built. The first crack in Grant Keller's empire did not sound like failure. It sounded like a printer warming up at 2:16 in the morning. Evelyn was alone in the restructuring firm's conference room, the city dark beyond the glass, the Hudson River carrying thin silver lines of moonlight between New Jersey and Manhattan. A client file had been left open on the secure server, one of dozens connected to a struggling parent company called Meridian North Holdings, and Keller and Rowe Capital appeared on the debt schedule like a name trying not to be noticed. Evelyn stared at it for a long time. Not because she was surprised to see Grant's company there, but because the numbers beneath it did not match the legend he had built around himself. In public, Keller and Rowe was untouchable. Its lobby smelled of cedar and expensive coffee. Its executives gave interviews about market discipline and generational wealth. Grant appeared in magazines beside phrases like rising force and trusted strategist. But inside the documents, the story was thinner. Keller and Rowe depended on credit lines that were quietly tightening. Several funds had underperformed for 3 straight quarters. A private guarantee from Meridian North was the beam holding up the ceiling, and Meridian North was no longer interested in carrying the weight. Evelyn read until the room became completely still. She did not smile. She did not feel the hot satisfaction she once imagined revenge would bring. What she felt was colder and far more useful: clarity. The man who had told her she made rooms feel smaller had been standing inside a room paid for by someone else. By sunrise, Evelyn had printed the public filings, cross-referenced the loan covenants, and written 6 pages of notes in blue ink. She asked for a meeting with Julian Mercer, a mergers and acquisitions attorney known for speaking softly and reading everything twice. Julian was in his early 50s, silver-haired, precise, and almost impossibly calm. He had advised family offices, distressed lenders, and private buyers who preferred silence over headlines. When Evelyn placed the folder on his desk, he did not rush. He opened it, turned each page, and let the quiet stretch until the traffic below sounded like rain. "You found this yourself?" he asked. Evelyn nodded. "They are not as strong as they look," she said. Julian looked again at the chart she had drawn by hand, tracing the ownership chain from Meridian North to the subsidiary that held the voting control over Keller and Rowe. Then he looked up at her with something that was not pity and not surprise. It was respect arriving without ceremony. "You do not need to destroy him," Julian said. "You only need to buy what he thinks protects him." The sentence stayed with her for months. Evelyn began working through an investment group that would later become Parker Meridian Holdings. She met with lenders in quiet offices 30 floors above Park Avenue. She learned which board members were tired, which creditors wanted out, which shareholders cared less about legacy than liquidity. She never used Grant's name unless a document required it. This was not about chasing him. This was about understanding the structure he had mistaken for power. While Grant attended charity breakfasts beside Clara Whitmore and spoke about the future of American finance, Evelyn sat across from attorneys, accountants, and private investors who asked hard questions and received harder answers. She wore simple blouses, carried her own folders, and listened more than she spoke. People underestimated her at first, as people often did when a woman entered a room without announcing how much she knew. Then she would ask one question about voting thresholds, hidden liabilities, or change of control clauses, and the room would shift. Back at the gala years later, Grant's voice rolled across the ballroom, polished and proud. Evelyn touched the edge of her clutch where Julian's message waited unseen. "Documents are signed." Above Grant's shoulder, the Keller and Rowe logo still glowed like a fortress. Evelyn knew better now. Some fortresses were only paperwork, and paperwork could change hands. The invitation arrived on a Thursday afternoon, 3 days before the gala, in an envelope thick enough to feel like arrogance. It was cream-colored, embossed with the silver seal of Keller and Rowe Capital, and addressed to Ms. Evelyn Parker, as if Grant wanted the absence of his last name to do part of the insulting for him. Evelyn found it on her desk at Parker Meridian Holdings, beside a stack of acquisition summaries and a cup of black coffee that had already gone cold. Outside her office window, Manhattan moved in clean vertical lines, glass towers catching the late winter sun, taxis crawling along the avenue like yellow sparks. She opened the envelope without hurry. Inside was a formal invitation to the 25th anniversary gala at the Whitmore Grand Hotel, followed by a handwritten card in Grant's sharp, expensive script. "It might help you finally understand the world you walked away from." Evelyn read the line once, then again, not because it hurt, because it was almost impressive how completely he misunderstood the silence he had mistaken for disappearance. Across from her desk, Julian Mercer stood near the window with a folder tucked beneath one arm. He had just come from a final call with Meridian North's council. The last voting agreement had been approved. The financing had cleared. The board packets were ready. Keller and Rowe Capital had not been rescued by an invisible investor, as Grant believed. It had been purchased through the very structure he never bothered to question, by the woman he thought had been left outside the room. Julian watched Evelyn place the card flat on the desk. "He sent that personally?" he asked. Evelyn nodded. The office was quiet except for the faint hum of the climate system and the muted sound of traffic 40 floors below. Julian did not smile. He simply opened the folder and turned it toward her. On the top page, beneath the black lettering of the acquisition agreement, her name waited for the final signature. Evelyn Parker, Managing Principal, Parker Meridian Holdings. For a moment, she did not move. Not out of doubt. Out of memory. She thought of the Queen's apartment, the navy suit, the restaurant on Madison Avenue, the marble sink, the cold apartment by the Hudson, the nights of reading until her eyes blurred, the mornings when no one clapped because rebuilding did not sound like victory while it was happening. Then she picked up the pen. The tip touched paper with a small, ordinary sound. No thunder. No music. No audience. Just ink crossing a line that would change everything Grant believed belonged to him. Julian gathered the signed pages and slid them back into the folder. "Once the announcement begins, the board will move quickly," he said. "Your arrival will not stay private for long." Evelyn looked down at Grant's invitation again. She could almost hear his voice behind the words, smooth and certain, offering her a seat at the edge of his triumph so she could witness the life he thought she had failed to reach. There had been a time when she might have replied with pain disguised as pride. There had been a time when she would have wanted him to know exactly what she had become. But that woman had learned better. Power did not need to knock loudly when it already had the key. Evelyn took out her phone and typed 2 words. "I'll be there." She did not add an exclamation point. She did not explain. She set the phone down, stood, and walked to the garment bag hanging on the back of her office door. Inside was the ivory dress, simple, unadorned, almost quiet. The kind of dress Grant would have once dismissed as too plain for a room like that. Evelyn touched the fabric lightly, then looked at her reflection in the darkened window. For the first time in years, she was not preparing to enter his world. She was preparing to let him discover who owned the door. By the time Evelyn stepped back into the ballroom, Grant had turned the gala into a stage for the version of himself he needed everyone to believe. The orchestra played something smooth and expensive near the west wall. Waiters moved between tables with silver trays, and the city glittered beyond the windows as if Manhattan itself had dressed for his approval. Grant stood beneath the Keller and Rowe logo, one hand wrapped around the microphone, the other resting close to Clara Whitmore, who smiled with the perfect softness of a woman certain the room belonged to her. Evelyn returned to her table near the service doors without hurry. No one noticed the way her phone had gone silent after Julian's message. No one noticed that she had stopped looking wounded long before Grant began speaking. They only saw the ivory dress, the quiet posture, the ex-wife seated at the edge of a room designed to make her feel small. Grant saw her too, and something in his smile sharpened. "Some people come back to old places hoping the world has changed for them," he said, letting his voice carry just enough warmth to sound like wisdom. A ripple of polite laughter moved through the tables. Clara lowered her champagne flute and tilted her head toward Evelyn with a sweetness that did not reach her eyes. "Evelyn, is it true you are still doing consulting work?" she asked, loud enough for the nearest guests to hear. "I always admire women who keep busy after a major life change." The words were wrapped in silk, but the room understood the needle. Evelyn looked at Clara, then at Grant, and answered with a calm that made the question feel smaller than it was. "Something like that." Grant gave a soft laugh into the microphone. "Evelyn always had a modest way of describing things," he said. "Even when we were married, she preferred little projects. Small offices. Simple goals." More laughter came this time, easier, braver. A man at the front table lifted his glass. A woman beside him covered her smile with 2 fingers. The master of ceremonies looked down at his notes, pretending not to hear. Evelyn folded her hands loosely in her lap. Her silver watch caught the light. 8:58 in the evening. 17 minutes. Grant walked down from the stage and approached her table as if granting an audience. Cameras near the sponsor wall turned slightly, drawn by the possibility of social theater. "You know," he said, lowering his voice just enough to seem intimate while still allowing nearby guests to listen. "I was surprised you accepted the invitation. These rooms can be difficult when you do not understand how they work." Evelyn looked up at him. For years, she had imagined what she might say if he ever offered her that same insult again. She had imagined anger. She had imagined a sentence sharp enough to make him bleed pride. But standing there beneath the chandeliers, she felt none of it. Only distance. Rooms are not difficult, Grant, she said. People make them that way. Clara's smile thinned. Grant blinked once, then recovered with the practiced ease of a man who had never allowed discomfort to remain on his face for longer than a second. Well, he said, lifting his glass toward the room. Some people visit worlds they cannot afford to stay in. This time, the laughter came too quickly, too loud. It filled the ballroom and bounced off the glass, but Evelyn heard the tiny vibration of every phone beginning to receive the first confidential alert. Board members looked down. One investor stopped smiling. Across the room, the chairman of Meridian North rose from his seat. Evelyn did not move. She only looked at the logo above Grant's shoulder as the lights dimmed by one careful degree. At exactly 9:15 in the evening, the orchestra softened without finishing the phrase, and every conversation in the ballroom seemed to lose its balance at the same time. Grant turned toward the stage, irritated by the interruption, still holding his champagne glass like a man certain the room would rearrange itself around him. The giant screen behind him flickered once. The Keller and Rowe logo vanished into black. For half a second, the entire ballroom stared at emptiness. Then the chairman of Meridian North Holdings stepped beneath the spotlight, his face pale beneath the careful tan of old money. He adjusted the microphone with both hands, and that small, unsteady movement did more to silence the guests than any announcement could have done. Grant frowned. Clara leaned closer to him. Near the service doors, Evelyn remained seated, her hands resting calmly on the tablecloth, her silver watch catching the dimmed light. The chairman cleared his throat. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight marks not only a celebration of 25 years of Keller and Rowe Capital, but the beginning of a new chapter under revised ownership. A murmur moved through the room, first soft, then sharp. Grant stepped forward as if he had misheard. Revised ownership, he said, not into the microphone, but loudly enough for the first 2 rows to turn. The chairman did not look at him. Effective tonight, controlling interest in Keller and Rowe Capital has been acquired through a completed transaction led by Parker Meridian Holdings. The name struck the ballroom with no sound at all. People did not gasp at first. They calculated. They looked at the screen, then at their phones, then at Evelyn. Grant gave a short laugh, the kind a man uses when reality has become too expensive to accept. There must be some mistake, he said. Clara's hand, which had been resting on his sleeve all evening, loosened by a single inch. Then the side doors opened. Julian Mercer entered in a dark suit, carrying a slim black folder, followed by 2 members of the board and a woman from corporate counsel. He did not hurry. He did not perform. He crossed the ballroom with the quiet authority of someone who had already finished the important work before the audience knew a show had begun. Every step pulled more attention away from Grant and toward Evelyn. When Julian reached her table, he stopped, inclined his head, and said clearly enough for the nearest microphones to catch it, "Ms. Parker, the board is ready for you." The words traveled faster than applause ever could. Evelyn rose. No dramatic gesture. No triumphant smile. Just the soft movement of an ivory dress, the quiet scrape of her chair against the carpet, and 300 people realizing they had been laughing at the owner. On the screen, the old logo dissolved. Silver letters reassembled into a new name, Parker Meridian Holdings. Beneath it appeared the formal statement of acquisition, clean and undeniable. Grant's phone began to vibrate against his palm. Once, twice, then continuously. He looked down, and the color drained from his expression in measured degrees. Executive access suspended pending board review. Emergency governance meeting at 9:30. Temporary removal from transaction authority. Corporate communications hold. His name, once announced with admiration, now appeared inside a chain of instructions written by people who no longer needed his permission. Clara stepped back so slowly that only Evelyn noticed the exact moment her fingers left his arm. Around the ballroom, investors opened confidential notices. Board members avoided Grant's eyes. The master of ceremonies stood frozen beside the podium, smiling at nothing. Grant looked at Evelyn as if seeing not his former wife, but every hour he had dismissed because it did not flatter him. Evelyn took the folder from Julian. The chairman lowered his head to her, not as a courtesy to a guest, but as recognition of authority. She signed one final acknowledgement on the podium, the pen moving once across the page. That was all. No speech. No insult. No correction of the past. The room had done the math for her. Grant stood beneath the new logo, small in the light he had believed belonged to him, while Evelyn Parker closed the folder and let silence complete the sentence he had started years ago. The silence, after Evelyn signed the acknowledgement, was not empty. It was crowded with everything Grant Keller had refused to see. The ballroom remained frozen beneath the chandeliers, 300 guests suddenly careful with their faces, their glasses, their whispers. The orchestra had stopped completely. Even the city beyond the windows seemed quieter, its lights pressed against the glass like distant witnesses. Evelyn handed the pen back to Julian Mercer, closed the black folder, and stepped away from the podium without looking for applause. She had not come for that. Applause was too easy. It belonged to rooms that changed loyalty as quickly as the screens changed logos. Grant stood near the stage, his phone still glowing in his hand, his name trapped inside messages he could no longer control. Clara was a few feet from him now, close enough to remain polite, far enough to make distance visible. For the first time all night, no one was laughing. Evelyn walked toward the exit with Julian beside her, her ivory dress moving softly against the dark carpet. People parted without being asked. A board member lowered his eyes. An investor who had smiled at Grant's earlier insult suddenly looked as if he wanted to apologize, but Evelyn gave him no opening. She had learned long ago that some apologies were only fear wearing better manners. In the corridor outside the ballroom, the air was cooler. The music was gone, replaced by the low hum of the hotel ventilation and the faint sound of traffic 41 floors below. Evelyn paused near the private elevators while Julian spoke quietly with corporate counsel behind her. She could see her reflection in the polished brass doors. The same face Grant had once dismissed as too simple for important rooms. The same eyes that had read debt schedules at 2 in the morning. The same hands that had signed divorce papers, acquisition agreements, and finally the document that changed the name above his life. Then she heard him. Evelyn. Grant's voice followed her down the corridor without its stage, without its microphone, without the warm confidence he used in front of people who believed him. She turned slowly. He stood several feet away, tie slightly loosened, expression caught between disbelief and something more painful than anger. He looked smaller in the hallway than he had beneath the lights. Not ruined, not destroyed, just finally measured without the room helping him. Why did you not tell me? He asked. Evelyn studied him for a moment. There was a time when that question would have opened a wound. Now it only revealed how little he understood. Tell you what, Grant, she said softly. That I was learning? That I was building? That I survived the life you were so certain I could not live without you? He looked away, then back at her. Was this revenge? The word hung between them, dramatic and insufficient. Evelyn glanced toward the ballroom doors, where the new Parker Meridian logo still glowed faintly through the gap. She thought of the younger woman in Queens pressing his first suit, the wife at the restaurant removing her ring beside a marble sink, the woman in the cold apartment drinking bitter coffee before sunrise. None of them had wanted revenge. They had wanted dignity, space, breath, a life that did not require shrinking to be loved. Evelyn met his eyes, and when she spoke, her voice carried no sharpness, only the calm finality of a door closing from the inside. No, Grant. Revenge would mean I still wanted something from you. The elevator opened behind her with a soft chime. Julian stepped aside, waiting. Grant took one step forward, then stopped, as if even his body understood there was no place left for him in her future. Evelyn entered the elevator without turning her back in anger. She simply left with the same composure he had mistaken for weakness. As the doors began to close, Grant saw the silver watch on her wrist, the quiet ivory dress. The woman he had placed near the service doors now reflected in polished brass, like someone the whole building had been waiting to recognize. She did not win him back. She did not need his regret to make her whole. She bought the world that once rejected her, not to belong inside it, but to prove she had outgrown it.